Welcome to 1 Minute to Midnight. I'm Wilfred Cunningham. This week, Brussels was attacked by suicide bombers. Radovan Karadzic was sentenced to 40 years in prison for genocide and war crimes, and the FBI postponed a court hearing in which they had sought cooperation from technology giant Apple in the accessing of a terrorist's cell phone. Of course, that's not the only thing that's been happening. There are many personal stories out there with no global significance, as fascinating as they are terrifying. Stories filled with grief and loss that will one day be gone forever. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the attacks on Brussels. On the 22nd of March, 2 nail bombs detonated inside the Brussels airport, and another detonated at a metro station. 34 people died in the attack, including 3 perpetrators, and over 300 were injured, making the attack the worst act of terrorism in Belgium's history. Counter-terrorist operations have been going on inside Belgium for some time, perhaps more overtly since the Paris attacks in November 2015, which were found to have been planned and carried out by an Islamic State cell based in the Belgian municipality of Sint-Hans-Molenbeek. It is reasonable to assume that authorities knew an attack might take place, as is evidenced by Jan Jambon, the Belgian Interior Minister, making a statement to that effect. There have been multiple arrests of people believed to be connected to the bombings. Security in Belgium, and across Europe, has been heightened, with much of the press speculating on when and where another attack may occur. Criticism has been levelled at the extent of the incident's coverage by Western media. Attacks in Pakistan on the 29th of March that, up to the point of writing, have killed 69 people, may not receive as much attention in Europe or the US. And although the recent attacks in Paris were covered extensively, an attack on Garissa University College in Kenya on the 2nd of April 2015, which killed a similar number of people and was perpetrated by Al-Shabaab, an Islamic militant organization allied with Al-Qaeda and opposed to ISIS, was comparatively far less reported on. There are many similar attacks, and many atrocities occurring within Iraq and Syria. ISIS burned at least 45 people to death in al-Baghdadi in early 2015. According to the UN, they have up to 3,500 people as slaves in Iraq. In 2014, they killed 1,500 unarmed Air Force cadets in Camp Speicher. The list of atrocities goes on. Radovan Karadzic, who was the president of the Republic of Srpska during the 1993 to 1995 Bosnian War and until 1996, was sentenced to 40 years imprisonment after an 8-year trial which culminated in him being found guilty of 1 count of genocide, 5 counts of crimes against humanity, and 4 counts of violations against the laws or customs of war.
The Chamber hereby sentences you, Radovan Karadzic, to a single sentence of 40 years of imprisonment.
He was arrested in 2008 after evading authorities for 12 years and living as a New Age doctor. Karadzic was a psychiatrist by profession, but led the Serbian population of what was once Yugoslavia on a military campaign in his capacity of President of the Serbian Republic, or Republika Srpska, and Commander-in-Chief of the Serbian Army, that has often been characterized as ethnic cleansing for targeting the Bosniak Muslim population, with soldiers under his command often killing all males they could find. The sentencing of Karadzic no doubt comes too late for those who suffered during the Bosnian War. But ultimately, he was arrested, charged, and convicted of the crimes he was responsible for. The trial of his army commander, Ratko Mladic, continues. What makes Karadzic's sentencing pertinent are there are similarities between the descent of the Yugoslav region into violence, with the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, and the raging of ethnic conflict. The validity of any comparison is debatable, but some are clear. People of different ethnicities populate both regions, with historical and sometimes overlapping attachments to locations. During the Yugoslav wars, several different militaries were involved alongside different factions within those militaries, as well as alongside separate entities. The conflict in Iraq and Syria, and the surrounding areas, is driven by ISIS, but also by groups fighting the government of Syria, who aren't necessarily affiliated with ISIS, and is made up of the forces of ISIS, the Iraqi army, the Syrian army, different Kurdish groups, different militias and ethnicities, Turkey, and also military assets from nations in Europe, from America, and from Russia. The conflict is not binary. It is not straightforward, and the purposes of actions are not always clear. Groups who oppose ISIS may also oppose each other, and groups who oppose each other may also have mutual allies. The Bosnian War and the ongoing war in the Middle East are regional, although have drawn in international intervention in different ways. However, their potential and actual overspill are vastly different. As is an important fact, the genocidal actions of Karadzic and other figures in the Yugoslav theatre were largely ethnically motivated. ISIS are not entirely ethnically motivated, although their pursuit of Yazidis proves they can be. Chiefly, however, ISIS persecutes others based on their religious beliefs and perceived religious infractions. The valid comparison, I would argue, is in the reasons not how these wars were conducted, or even started, but how they were allowed to happen. Yugoslavia came into existence after World War I, much like Iraq. After being occupied by the Germans and their allies during the Second World War, Yugoslavia came under the control of the Soviets. Josip Broz Tito, who led what was widely regarded as one of the most successful partisan campaigns during the war, became the president and remained so for the rest of his life, ruling the country as a socialist dictatorship independent of the USSR. His regime was authoritarian and relied on the suppression of opposition, but Tito was arguably reserved with his power and well respected by the Yugoslavian peoples and by foreign powers. When he died in 1980, 4 kings, 31 presidents, 6 princes, 22 prime ministers, and 47 ministers of foreign affairs attended his funeral. Immediately, speculation began about the ability for Yugoslavia to survive post-Tito. Before his death, Tito replaced the office of President of Yugoslavia with the Yugoslav Presidency, an 8-member collective head of state composed by representatives from the 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces that made up Yugoslavia. After Tito's inclusive but authoritarian regime, the Yugoslav presidency's rotating single-year terms for each leader of the republics and provinces proved highly ineffective without the guidance and leadership of Tito. A decade after his death, Yugoslavia began to fragment along lines of independent states and ethnicity, culminating in bloody wars and genocides. Tito was a dictator, and was no doubt responsible for the suppression of human rights in his country. But like Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad, his leadership was total and unifying. Under Tito, ethnic violence was essentially crushed. Hussein may have been guilty of ethnic cleansing, but under his rule, and the rule of al-Assad, before his power was weakened, ISIS would never be able to rise as they have. The comparison I draw between Yugoslavia and the conflict in Iraq and Syria is that those places were ruled by strong leaders, and those leaders were succeeded by power vacuums. And I would argue that those power vacuums enabled genocide. Finally, the Federal Bureau of Investigation postponed a hearing with Apple Incorporated on the 21st of March, in which they had sought a ruling ordering Apple to help access a cell phone used by a domestic terrorist. Their reason for the last-minute postponement was that they were exploring a possible route into unlocking the phone without Apple's help. The issue is divisive, as it questions the scope of the United States Fourth Amendment, the protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. It calls into question how much access government should have to citizens' electronic goods and digital lives. Apple has vehemently fought against helping the FBI, and argue that to do so they would have to undermine their own products, and possibly all digital products capable of communication or tracking certain data, and would enable massive invasion of privacy. The FBI argue that access to locked cell phones is necessary for security, and a right of law enforcement, similar to the right to search property. Some have said that Apple is not genuinely concerned with privacy, but are more concerned with the customer base who use Apple products because of their inaccessibility to others, and Apple's more general reputation. Whatever is true, should the FBI, or another agency, succeed in breaking through Apple's security, Apple's legal arguments for not helping government efforts will become irrelevant. Until the next security problem. Of course, all of this is only assuming that the US government hasn't always had access to Apple's products, and has only stated otherwise to ensure that those being monitored don't move to other communication devices. We may never know of the true extent, or lack of reach, the intelligence and law agencies of our governments may have. They may never know either. So until next time, goodbye, and try to remain calm.